Welcome to this edition of Head to Head. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 404 of the podcast. And on this episode, I'm talking about star point guards Chris Paul's retirement from the game of basketball. So one of the strangest storylines of the NBA this season was the Clippers bringing back arguably the franchise best player in Chris Paul, only to send him away for reportedly being too opinionated. This saga has come to a close with Paul announcing his retirement from the NBA. Chris Paul is a 12-time All-Star. He had career averages of 16.8 points per game and 9.2 assists. 7 times he was on the NBA All-Defensive First Team. 5 times he led the league in assists, and 6 times he led the league in steals. His 23,058 points is 41st all-time, and his 12,552 assists is second all-time behind only John Stockton. I think some people forget that when I first started to watch basketball around 2007, there was a time in his career where Chris Paul did emerge as the best point guard in all of basketball, because for a while there, he had a bit of a rival in Deron Williams, but Paul proved to be the more consistent player. And then he gets traded to LA, and it feels like the Clippers are going to become the next it team in the NBA, but then Steph Curry and the Warriors come out of nowhere and become a dynasty, and instead of becoming an NBA champ, Paul became one of those all-time greats that never won. Paul made the NBA Finals one time as a member of the Phoenix Suns, where he lost to Giannis Antetokounmpo and the Milwaukee Bucks. My personal view on Chris Paul as a player is, even though he scored a lot of points, he really was a traditional point guard. Lob City with Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan does not happen without Chris Paul. I do want to get into a little bit the bittersweet ending of his career, because in basketball, more than in other sports, it's hard to watch great players age because it's hard for them to turn into role players. It was for Allen Iverson, it was for Carmelo Anthony, and for Chris Paul. These guys were so used to getting the ball. How could Chris Paul have any impact on a team without being the team's primary ball handler? Yes, the idea of Chris Paul being a backup point guard logically makes sense. He's a guy who's going to make the right basketball decisions, but he's just not used to not being the point guard on a basketball team. There's very few examples in the history of basketball of superstar players who later turned into willing role players. I mean, I can only think of a few. Vince Carter, I think at the end of his career, became a really good role player in that he could occasionally hit a three-point shot, and he could accept the fact that he was no longer the Vince Carter who could score 25 points per game. My point is, the all-time greats were not coming off of the bench back in the day. Larry Bird didn't go from being the best player on the Celtics to being their 10th man. That just didn't happen back then, and we're seeing it happen more and more in modern basketball, but to not a great success rate. I bring up Allen Iverson because his time in Detroit was really painful to watch as a fan of his. He just didn't know how to handle not being the main star player on a basketball team. And that's really how you get a situation of like what happened to Chris Paul and the Clippers, because this is a situation where he's going back to a place where he was the main star. They're looking at him and going, you're not the Chris Paul who was here in the 2010s. You are a different kind of player, and he's here saying, I'm still Chris Paul, you should take me seriously. And don't get me wrong, the Clippers are just as much to blame as CP3 is for how this all played out. Don't bring him back if you don't have a plan on how to use him. I think the Clippers brought him back to celebrate his career. Instead, they made things awkward between the franchise and one of its greatest stars. This is also a Clippers team that traded away Blake Griffin a few months after giving him a massive contract contract extension. Way more people are on the side of Chris Paul than they are on the Clippers, and rightfully so, because we look at the Clippers as an organization and we go, you are not a team that is winning enough basketball games, despite the fact that you have great players on your team. I mean, the Clippers had Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, Jamal Crawford. Then they paired Kawhi Leonard with Paul George. Now they have Kawhi Leonard as their lone star. If Chris Paul had gone to, say, the Nets and had this kind of breakup with them, it would not have been a big deal. But because it's with the Clippers, it becomes a thing, and it's going to be a thing that's talked about for a very long time. I mean, what is his relationship going to be like moving forward with that organization? Are they going to retire his number? Is he going to want to stay away? I talked about on this podcast about how I was a fan of what the Clippers had done this past offseason. They had Kawhi Leonard and James Harden, and they brought in more veteran players, the likes of Brook Lopez and Chris Paul, and I thought they would be a more than solid basketball team that could compete for a playoff spot. And they had a tremendously terrible start to the season, and it is worth noting that since they've gotten rid of Chris Paul, they have played much better basketball. But then the team had an awkward breakup with James Harden as well, and we don't know who to blame between the Clippers and James Harden. Is James Harden just wanting to leave the Clippers because of his contract situation, or are the Clippers looking more towards the future? Look, I don't know the answer to all of that. All I know is there's too many controversies right now regarding the LA Clippers. The Chris Paul one just feels like the most self-inflicted of them all. Like, there's nothing that should have gone wrong with this situation. All you had to do was just play Chris Paul, 10 to 15 minutes a game and have a quiet, nice season, try to make the playoffs. I get it. You're a bad team. You want to hit the reset button. This guy is getting on your nerves. But think about it. It's going to look bad if you get rid of Chris Paul. What's the harm with keeping him around and just playing him those 10 to 15 minutes? You're not a very good basketball team. You're not going to be a title contending team this year anyway. No one's saying you had to make Chris Paul the starting point guard of your team or play him major minutes. If anything, you have to put him into a situation where he turns himself into the bad guy. The Clippers made themselves the easiest of targets when it came to the Chris Paul situation. The headlines were basically the LA Clippers are sending Chris Paul home. That is not a sentence that should ever be said out loud. And no matter what the actual situation was, nobody was ever going to give the LA Clippers the benefit of the doubt, and they should have known better. Once you made the situation to sign Chris Paul, you stick it out for the entire year and you let him quietly retire. You can't just treat him like another basketball player, because we're not talking about another basketball player. We're talking about Chris Paul, the guy that most people believe to be the greatest LA Clipper of all time. And this is an organization that's not the Lakers. They don't have a huge number of legendary players. So it's a bigger deal when one of them is about to walk away from the sport. And for you to bring him back, people are going to look at that and go, wow, this is a big deal. Chris Paul is back on the Clippers. I hope he has a great farewell tour. But instead, he gets sent home. Switching the subject, I can't do a podcast about Chris Paul without talking about my favorite year of his playing career, his lone season with the Oklahoma City Thunder, where he was paired with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Not only did Chris Paul have a great statistical year for the Thunder, he ended up being the perfect mentor to the future MVP award winner. I loved the fact that he didn't pout about the trade. He just went about his business and had a great year where the Thunder went to the playoffs. I had never been more impressed with Chris Paul than that season. And what that year proved to me is maybe you're not going to win a title with Chris Paul as your best player, but you're going to have a floor. You're not going to be a bad basketball team. Because he's your point guard, you're most likely going to make the playoffs. It should also be noted that Chris Paul is one of those players that can be paired with a number of different star players. He was great with Blake Griffin. He was great with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. He was great with Devin Booker. And he was great with James Harden. So now it's time to ask the big question about Chris Paul. Where does he rank amongst the all-time great point guards? Ahead of him are the obvious ones: Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas, Steph Curry, John Stockton. I don't know what to tell you if you believe that Chris Paul is better than any of those point guards. The players you could have a debate about, to me, is Steve Nash and Jason Kidd. I personally believe that Steve Nash, a two-time MVP, is better than both Chris Paul and Jason Kidd, but I could at least hear out the argument on somebody who believes that Chris Paul is better than Steve Nash. I will listen to that argument. I won't agree, but I'll listen. 2 point guards who I do believe Chris Paul is way better than are Dame Lillard and Russell Westbrook. I like both of those players. I just think Chris Paul is way better than both of them. The Westbrook thing just got a little too annoying for me at the end, and when it comes to Dame Lillard, things did not work out between him and the Milwaukee Bucks, and I think I do put that on Dame Lillard, that he couldn't make it work with Giannis Antetokounmpo. Could you imagine if I paired Giannis with Chris Paul? I think that team, at the very least, makes it to the NBA Finals if I have Chris Paul in his prime with Giannis. Chris Paul is without a doubt a top 10 point guard in the history of basketball, and I could listen to somebody who was trying to persuade me that he's in the top 5. I'll say this about him: he was one of the truly last classical point guards. I mean, we have those debates all the time. Is Russell Westbrook actually a point guard, or is he just a guy who was given the ball all the time? I mean, the usage rates are out of control for these players. Is James Harden a point guard? I don't know. Maybe it's a cliche to call Chris Paul a floor general, but that's what he was. Somebody who set the pace for the entire game. And right now, we are definitely in the era of the score-first point guards, the Steph Currys, the Dame Lillards. Those are the point guards that are thriving right now. I personally love to watch guys like Chris Paul. One of my favorite point guards of all time was Rajon Rondo. These pass-first point guards. That's what was so special about a guy like Steve Nash. Yes, he could score 25 points a game if he wanted to, but his main objective was to feed guys like Amar'e Stoudemire, and the same goes for Chris Paul. I believe Chris Paul could have scored over 20 points per game throughout his entire career, but instead he chose to feed the ball to guys like Blake Griffin. Paul doesn't get enough credit for just how unselfish his game actually was. I also just don't buy some of the critiques people had about his actual basketball game. Towards the end, you used to hear stuff like he's too obsessed with hitting the mid-range jump shot. I mean, Chris Paul was a 37% three-point shooter. He's no slouch. I get it. He's not Steph Curry. He's not Klay Thompson. He's not a guy who's hitting threes at that rate. But he was still better than the average three-point shooter. But I do think that's an interesting conversation to have about Chris Paul's career is, did the three-point shot becoming the dominant shot in basketball ruin Chris Paul's chances of winning an NBA championship, right? Because when he was with the Clippers, he had Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan, and he was lobbing them the ball, and then you had Steph Curry and Klay Thompson draining threes, and those threes led to a dynasty where the lobbings led to absolutely nothing but entertainment. I mean, the one time that Chris Paul went to the NBA Finals, he was paired with a great three-point shooter in Devin Booker. A coincidence? I think not. You're supposed to say this when a great basketball player retires, but I really do feel this way towards Chris Paul. I don't know if we'll ever see another Chris Paul, because those are just not the type of basketball players you're seeing today. You're seeing the Nikola Jokic's of the world average triple doubles. I mean, that is a big man who is being defined as the best passer in basketball, not a pure point guard. I do feel like there will be a number of basketball fans unwilling to talk about Chris Paul like he's an all-time great because he never won the NBA Finals. I get it, but the guy is in good company here. Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, John Stockton, Carmelo Anthony, Tracy McGrady. These were all-time great basketball players. You knew it when you were watching them. I don't feel any differently towards them because they didn't end up winning it all. Yes, it would have been great for their careers. But when I think about the best basketball players of all time, I still bring up their names, rings or no rings. That's where the conversation about ring chasing gets stupid. So let's say, remember when Chris Paul went to the Warriors? What if that Warriors team won the NBA Finals? Am I now supposed to feel differently about Chris Paul? Am I supposed to feel better about his overall career because when he was the 10th man on the Warriors, they ended up winning a ring? That's ridiculous. We all knew what we were watching when we were watching Chris Paul, one of the all-time great point guards in NBA history, who deserved a way better ending to his career than the one that he got as a member of the LA Clippers. I have never known an NBA without Chris Paul. He was one of those central figures. I first started to watch basketball and he was rising, and then he became the premier point guard of the time. And yes, he got overlapped by Steph Curry, but he still remained one of the best players in the league. He was one of those guys I badly wanted to see win an NBA Finals. I wanted Chris Paul to get that ring so that people would talk about him more in the conversation of the all-time great point guards. And even though that did not happen, I still believe he deserves that honor to be mentioned amongst the likes of the Steph Currys, the Steve Nashes, the Magic Johnsons, the Isaiah Thomases of the world, and the John Stocktons. I know people love to say that we are now in the realm of positionless basketball, but watching a point guard who knows what he's doing is still one of the most entertaining things to see when watching basketball. A guy who is in complete control of his craft and knows what he wants to do and knows how to help others. And it was from the jump he knew what he was doing. I remember him in New Orleans with David West. He turned David West into an all-star. Peja Stojakovic was on that team as well. And like I was saying at the top of the podcast, early on there was this little rivalry between Chris Paul and Deron Williams, who is going to emerge as the point guard of the league, and it ended up being Chris Paul. And I will come to his defense for him not winning an NBA Finals by saying this: Chris Paul is not the reason Chris Paul does not have a ring. So many, and I mean so many people come to the defense of the players of the 90s, the Patrick Ewings of the world, the Karl Malones of the world, and they say, well, those guys didn't win a ring because they were up against Michael Jordan and an all-time great Bulls team. Well, guess what? Chris Paul doesn't have a ring because of Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors. He went up against an all-time team and at one point took them to a Game 7 as a member of the Houston Rockets. The same thing that happened to those great players of the 90s happened to Chris Paul. He went up against an all-time great in Steph Curry and just barely missed winning it all. I don't think there's shame in that. I don't love how the career ended. I think it's partially Chris Paul's fault, but I blame the Clippers more than Paul because they should have known the situation. If you're bringing back an all-time great, you have to treat him like he's an all-time great. And the absolute last thing I want to say on this podcast is I will miss watching Chris Paul play the game of basketball. He was one of the most entertaining players to watch. The Clippers were a joke before before Chris Paul got there. He went to the Western Conference Finals with James Harden. The Phoenix Suns went to the NBA Finals largely because of Chris Paul. He was able to have so much success with so many different teams and so many different kinds of NBA stars because he was such a great classical point guard. And I just don't believe that they are developing young point guards to be like Chris Paul. I think the league needs more guys like Chris Paul. And look, I know people are going to get hung up on the fact that Chris Paul never won an NBA title, but he was on teams with championship aspirations. I understand that. But injuries to him and teammates always seem to factor into the equation. I know some people didn't like him, but I always enjoyed watching him play, and I am going to miss watching Chris Paul, aka CP3. Thanks for listening to this edition of Head to Head. I'm Cam McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every week on Apple Podcast and Spotify, so please rate, review, and subscribe.